The officer responsible for defending Sydney Harbour against submarine attack had spent more of his career thinking about exactly this scenario than almost any man alive. He had sat on the Royal Navy's inquiry into how a German submarine slipped through harbour defences and sank a British battleship at anchor. He had studied the failure in detail. He had written the reports. He understood, with the precision of a man who investigates disasters for a living, exactly what adequate harbour defence required, and exactly what happened when it was absent. On the night of the 31st of May, 1942, he was at a dinner party. By the time the last Japanese submarine cleared the harbour entrance that night, 21 Allied sailors were dead. The largest warship in the harbour had been missed by a margin that physics cannot dramatise, and the government's official account of what had occurred described 21 dead men as the loss of one small harbour vessel of no military value. Tell me in the comments. Before today, had you ever heard of the Japanese attack on Sydney Harbour? Because what happened across those 9 hours will make you question every assumption you hold about how a war reaches a city that believes itself beyond range. Now let's go. The surface understanding of events is straightforward enough. In December of 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drew the United States into the Pacific War, and set in motion a sequence of Allied defeats that continued without interruption across the following 6 months. Singapore fell on the 15th of February, 1942. Darwin was bombed on the 19th of February, a raid that put more aircraft over Australian soil than Pearl Harbor had put over Hawaii. Broome was struck 2 weeks after that. The strategic picture, visible to any senior officer paying attention, was one of a Japanese advance moving southward with a speed that made planning for what came next almost impossible to execute before the next blow landed. That is the surface version. What it obscures is something more specific and considerably more uncomfortable. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, 5 Ko-hyoteki class Midget submarines were part of the assault. All 5 were lost. 9 of the 10 crew members died. The one survivor was taken prisoner. Allied forces recovered one of the vessels largely intact within hours of the attack and examined it thoroughly. Every Allied command in the Pacific received detailed technical intelligence about the type, its capability, and its delivery method within days. The tactic had failed at Pearl Harbor, but the tactic had been demonstrated, and Australia knew it. 6 months before Japanese Midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour, Allied command in the Pacific knew they existed, knew precisely how they were deployed, and had studied a recovered specimen in detail. The vessels were 2-man, battery-powered, torpedo-armed, approximately 24 metres long, transported to their launch point by large I-class submarines, and released in the approaches to the target harbour. The knowledge was not classified. The lesson was not obscure. By May of 1942, the group of Japanese submarines tasked with the Sydney operation had assembled and was moving. The Eastern Attack Group of the 8th Submarine Squadron, under the command of Captain Hankyu Sasaki, embarked in I-21, comprised 5 large I-class submarines positioned in an arc off the New South Wales coast. 3 of them, I-22, I-24 and I-27, carried 2-man Midget submarines fixed to their rear upper decks as deck cargo. The other 2, I-21 and I-29, each carried a Yokosuka floatplane capable of aerial reconnaissance. A 6th submarine, I-28, had been intended to participate. On the 17th of May, USS Tautog torpedoed I-28 on the surface and sent her to the bottom along with the Midget submarine and its crew she had been carrying. The strategic purpose of the attack was not territorial. Japan was not planning to take Sydney. The Eastern Attack Group offered disruption, propaganda, and the kind of psychological damage that can only be delivered by demonstrating to a civilian population that nowhere was beyond reach. The primary target, once aerial reconnaissance confirmed what was in the harbour, was the most powerful Allied warship at anchor there, the American heavy cruiser USS Chicago. 3 weeks before the attack, Chicago and the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra had both fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Both had returned to Sydney for replenishment. Both were moored in the harbour on the night of the 31st of May. Japanese intelligence knew it. What gave Sasaki the confirmation he needed came on the 30th of May, the night before the attack, when Flying Warrant Officer Susumu Ito, 27 years old, launched from I-21 in the small hours of the morning and flew directly over the harbour. He came as low as 30 metres between the harbour bridge and Chicago's superstructure. 3 searchlights caught him in succession. 3 times he climbed into cloud to escape them. He saw both cruisers at anchor. He returned to I-21 and reported to Sasaki that the targets were confirmed. On landing, the float plane struck rough water and flipped. Both Ito and his navigator were pulled from the sea. The night before the attack, Australia's most significant harbour had been overflown at low altitude by a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. An Australian artillery battery at Middle Head observed the plane and identified it as an American Curtiss Falcon. A 14-year-old roof spotter named Tim Edelman, stationed at the Hotel Manly, heard the aircraft's distinctive engine and described it as a putting sound unlike anything he recognized. He filed a report. It was not acted on. On that same 30th of May, something else had occurred that should have placed every Allied port in the region at heightened alert. Japanese Midget submarines had conducted an identical operation against the British naval anchorage at Diego Suarez in Madagascar. The same tactic, the same vessel class, the same delivery by I-class mother submarines. Allied command was notified. The attack was attributed to Vichy French forces. No alert was distributed to other command regions. Sydney received no warning. Sasaki gave the order to proceed. The officer responsible for everything that followed was Rear Admiral Gerard Charles Muirhead Gould, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross during the First World War. Born in London on the 29th of May, 1889, he was Royal Navy, not Royal Australian Navy, a distinction that mattered to the Australian officers under his command in ways they did not always conceal. He had been appointed naval officer in command of Sydney Harbour in February of 1940. A heart condition prevented him from serving at sea during the war. Between 1933 and 1936, he had been assigned to the British Embassy in Berlin, keeping Winston Churchill personally informed of Germany's military build-up. Churchill at one point considered him for Chief Director of the Secret Intelligence Service. This was the calibre of officer Australia had been given. On the 14th of October, 1939, the German submarine U-47 slipped through the harbour defences at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, found the British battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor, and sank her. 833 men died. The Admiralty convened a board of inquiry into how a submarine had penetrated harbour defences and what could be done to prevent it happening again. Muirhead Gould was one of 3 senior officers on that board. He studied the failure with the rigour of a man who understood that the only value of a catastrophe is the instruction it provides against the next one. 4 months later, he was appointed to command Sydney Harbour. The man who had spent weeks determining how a submarine penetrated harbour defences was now responsible for ensuring it did not happen somewhere else. The harbour he commanded was not adequately defended. The anti-torpedo boom net stretched between George Head and Greenpoint on the southern approach, but on the 31st of May, 1942, only the central section was complete. The indicator loops, cables on the harbour floor that detected engine noise and traced crossing signals on a stylograph ashore, required competent continuous watchkeeping to function as designed. The Mobile Harbour Defence Force comprised 7 converted Sydney pleasure yachts fitted with machine guns and depth chargers. Not patrol boats in any professional military sense. Not the anti-submarine craft the Royal Navy's post-Scapa Flow guidance had specified. 7 converted pleasure yachts, armed with enough firepower to engage a small surface vessel and barely enough speed to follow one. Sydney wits called them the Hollywood Fleet. On the 20th of January 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and 4 months before the attack, Acting Commander Harvey Newcomb, the commander of Australia's anti-submarine training facility, sent a written warning to Muirhead Gould. He was not satisfied, he wrote, that an efficient indicator loop watchkeeping scheme was being carried out at South Head. He was specific. An officer should always be present in the loop control room, and 2 ratings should always be on watch. He was writing with direct knowledge of how the Midget submarine tactic had been used at Pearl Harbor. He understood what the loops were designed to detect, and what would happen if they were not properly manned when such a vessel crossed them. The warning was received. Nothing changed. New Zealand naval authorities detected coded radio communications between Japanese submarines on the 26th and 29th of May, and provided direction-finding data indicating submarines approaching Sydney. No significant defensive response was authorised. The warning had been written in January. The indicator loops were understaffed. The boom was incomplete. The man in charge understood precisely what adequate defence looked like. The harbour he commanded was not it. Before any of what followed can be fully understood, 3 things need to be established about the men who would do it. The first is the Senembari. When Lieutenant Q Matsuo took his final leave of his family at Kure Naval Base in late March of 1942, before departing aboard I-22 for the waters off the New South Wales coast, his father gave him a short ceremonial sword wrapped in his mother's wedding obi, the silk sash from her own wedding, now serving as its sheath. His sister Fuji had sewn 1 stitch into a senembari, a belt of 1,000 stitches meant to protect its wearer and carry him home. 999 other women had each sewn a single additional stitch. 999 women had blessed a man they would never meet, and whose name most of them did not know. The family watching Matsuo depart understood what the occasion was. They did not speak about it in those terms. They did not need to. Petty Officer First Class Masao Tsuzuku would die alongside him. The second thing is a letter. Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban, who would command the 2nd Midget submarine to enter Sydney Harbour, had written before the operation that nations which feared death would surely be destroyed, and that the spirit of readiness to die would bring final victory. Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe, his navigator and fellow crew member in M24, left no account of his private calculations. The absence does not indicate less resolution. It indicates a different temperament. Before departure, an explosion in I-24's battery compartment on the 18th of May had killed 1 crew member and badly burned another. The replacement vessel assigned to Ban and Ashibe was the Midget submarine originally built for I-28. The submarine USS Tautog had already destroyed. Ban went into battle in a hastily reassigned vessel prepared for a different crew. He did not ask to be reassigned. He prepared the replacement submarine and waited. The third thing is Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman and Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Omori, who would command the first submarine through the Eastern Gate. Their vessel would become entangled in the boom net before they could fire a single torpedo. They would die having done nothing of what they came to do. All 6 men were professionals who had done the calculation and accepted its answer. The submarines themselves were not what the word midget implies. A Ko-hyoteki class vessel ran approximately 24 meters from bow to stern. 46 tons submerged. 208 batteries providing the power for motors capable of 19 knots underwater. 2 torpedo tubes in the bow. The entry hatch measured 13 inches by 30 inches. A man could enter. He could not turn around inside. 2 men occupied this interior in darkness and near silence for however long the operation required, navigating by a memorized chart, a compass, and the sounds that reached them through the hull. In the early evening of the 31st of May, 1942, the 3 Midget submarines detached from their mother vessels and began the long approach to Sydney Heads. Captain Saseki watched from I-21 as the last of them disappeared beneath the swell. He did not expect to see any of them again. USS Chicago was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser. She carried 8-inch guns, displaced approximately 10,000 tons, and had a complement of approximately 750 men. 3 weeks before the Sydney attack, she had fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea, survived Japanese air attacks, and returned to Sydney for replenishment and repair. On the night of the 31st of May, she was moored at the man-of-war anchorage near the harbour bridge. Not at sea. Not at any elevated state of alert. Moored. Her captain was Howard Douglas Bode. He was born on the 23rd of January, 1889, the same birth year as Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould. He was not popular with his crew, described by contemporaries in terms that suggested a man whose authority expressed itself through rigidity rather than confidence. On the 7th of December, 1941, he had been ashore when his previous command, the battleship USS Oklahoma, was torpedoed and capsized at Pearl Harbor. He arrived at the harbor to find her upside down in the mud, with hundreds of men still trapped inside her hull. He was given command of Chicago and brought her to Sydney. On the night of the 31st of May, 1942, he was at a dinner party. His host was Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould. The harbour they were jointly responsible for presented a specific physical picture that evening. An overcast sky hid the full moon. Sydney ferries ran their regular routes, their engine signatures crossing the same indicator loops the watchkeeping staff had learned to attribute to regular traffic. At Garden Island Naval Base, approximately 200 metres from Chicago's anchorage, construction work on a dry dock was proceeding through the night. Arc welding blazed under floodlights. The lights illuminated the waterfront, the wharves, and everything behind them. Chicago, moored between the Garden Island lights and any observer looking westward from the centre of the harbour, stood out with the clarity of a ship on a lit stage. Those lights would not be extinguished until 12:25 in the morning of the 1st of June, 1 hour and 58 minutes after Muirhead Gould eventually sounded his general alarm. When a Japanese submarine lined up its firing position at Chicago, the lights of Australia's own naval base would provide the backlighting that made the silhouette possible. A strong southerly current had run against all 3 submarines throughout their approach to Sydney Heads, and it had cost each of them time. Truman reached the harbour mouth approximately 1 hour behind the planned schedule. Ben was 2 hours behind. This staggered arrival was not in Sasaki's order of battle. The sea had arranged it, and it meant the attack, designed as a coordinated assault from 3 directions, arrived instead as 3 separate incursions spread across more than 4 hours. Had all 3 submarines entered the harbour within minutes of each other, the Hollywood fleet would have been overwhelmed before it could respond to any of them. The current that slowed those submarines across the afternoon of the 31st of may have saved Chicago and every other vessel in the harbour that night. At approximately 8 o'clock, M14, Truman and Omori's vessel, reached the harbour entrance and passed through the eastern gate. The indicator loop recorded the crossing. The watchkeeper noted the signal. It corresponded in pattern to a Sydney ferry using the same gate at the same time. He attributed it to ferry traffic. He did not report it. M14 changed heading from east to west, moving toward the western sector of the boom. Here the propellers made contact with the steel mesh of the net, the central section that had been completed. They became entangled. Truman attempted to reverse and break free. He could not. At approximately 9:30, a 52-year-old Maritime Services Board watchman named James Cargill was conducting his patrol along the boom when he saw something caught in the mesh that did not belong there. Something large and dark, partly submerged, pressed against the steel. He reported it to Sub-Lieutenant Harold Ayers, commanding HMAS Yoroma, one of the Hollywood Fleet patrol boats moored nearby. Ayers did not approach the object. Instead, he sent Cargill and a second man back to the net in a rowing skiff to confirm the sighting. Cargill rowed out to the object in the dark. He looked at it. He reported back to Ayers. It was a submarine. It was now approaching 10 o'clock at night. 2 hours had elapsed since M14's crossing was logged and dismissed. HMAS Yoroma and HMAS Lolita began moving toward the boom. Lolita dropped 3 depth charges. They were set to explode at a depth the shallow water beneath the boom made physically impossible. The charges fell harmlessly to the harbour bed. Yoroma's commander requested permission from Sydney Naval Headquarters to open fire and waited for a reply. At 9:48 in the evening, the indicator loop at the eastern gate recorded another crossing. The watchkeeper noted it. Like the previous signal, it corresponded to a ferry. He attributed it to ferry traffic. Sub-Lieutenant Ban had brought M24 to the harbour entrance and passed through the eastern gate, following a Manly ferry running its regular service. His submarine grazed the hull of the auxiliary patrol vessel HMAS Fally as it passed in the dark. Fally's crew felt the contact and reported it to Harbour Command. The report was not followed up. M24 was inside Sydney Harbour. No alarm had been raised in response to its crossing. No depth charge had been dropped near it. No searchlight had found it. It had followed a commuter ferry through the one functioning gate in the harbour's primary defence and was now moving west through the water toward the ships at anchor beyond. Shortly before 11 o'clock, Matsuo's M22 approached the entrance. The unarmed auxiliary patrol boat Laureana spotted the conning tower breaking the surface and sent alerts to the port war signal station at South Head and to HMAS Yandra. Yandra moved toward the contact, attempted to ram, lost it, regained it at 3 minutes past 11, and fired a full pattern of 6 depth charges. The detonations were felt through the floors of houses in the surrounding suburbs. Windows broke in Kremen. People standing in their gardens felt the concussion through the ground. M22 dived deep. It settled on the harbour floor and waited. At 10:27 in the evening, Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould sounded a general alarm, ordering all vessels in the harbour to take anti-submarine precautions and closing the harbour to outbound traffic. The alarm was repeated 9 minutes later. The ferries continued their routes. At 10:35 in the evening, inside M14, caught in the boom net, Truman made his decision. He detonated the scuttling charge. The forward end of the submarine split apart in a single explosive instant. Truman and Omori were killed instantly. Debris was hurled 10 meters into the air. HMAS Lolita was lifted on a surge of displaced water. The sound crossed the surrounding suburbs and brought hundreds of people out into the streets. Somewhere in the darkness to the west, inside the inner harbour, Sub-Lieutenant Ban was still moving. The explosion at the boom had drawn every searchlight toward the western sector. M24 was moving in the opposite direction, deeper into the harbour, toward the warships at anchor. The 2 most senior Allied officers in Sydney were already heading back toward their posts when Truman's submarine blew itself apart. Neither man, at this point, believed that what was happening in the harbour was what it was. Bode arrived at Chicago and went aboard. He confronted the officers of the watch, men who, on proper initiative, had already begun preparing the ship for departure and had ordered USS Perkins to commence an anti-submarine screening patrol around the cruiser. He heard the reports coming through the communications nets. He had heard the explosions from the shore. He accused his officers of being drunk. The information reaching him was not rumour. It was the direct testimony of trained naval officers who had been watching the harbour with binoculars while their captain had been at dinner. The departure orders already sensibly given by the officer of the watch were revoked. The anti-submarine screening patrol was cancelled. Bode did not accept what he was being told until events made disbelief physically impossible. Muirhead Gould set out on a barge toward the boom net at approximately 11:30 to conduct a personal inspection. He reached HMAS Lolita at approximately midnight. The Hollywood fleet was racing across the harbour in multiple directions, dropping depth charges, swinging searchlights, firing flares that illuminated the water in sudden white bursts. Thousands of Sydney-siders were watching from rooftops and parks and cliffs around the harbour as the detonations continued. Muirhead Gould looked at what was happening around him and reportedly demanded to know what everyone was playing at, telling the crew they were wasting their time running up and down the harbour, dropping depth charges when there were no submarines to find. He concluded that a single submarine had been responsible for the night's events, that it had already departed and returned to shore. On Chicago, a mate named Art King and a duty electrician, known to his shipmates as Moose Clendenin, were at their station on the searchlight platform high in the cruiser's superstructure. At approximately 10:50 in the evening, Clendenin announced that he could see a submarine. King later recalled that Clendenin suddenly said he saw a submarine, and that when King followed his line of sight, he could see something resembling a small conning tower or large periscope coming up the channel at a slow rate of speed and leaving a tiny wake. King turned on Chicago's searchlight and lit up Ban's submarine, which immediately dived. Ban brought M24 back to the surface and ran alongside the cruiser, close enough to be making a definitive identification of his target. So close, in fact, that it was not possible for Chicago's gun crews to depress the weapons far enough to engage him at that range. Chicago fired. Her 5-inch gun sent rounds across the water. They skipped off the surface and struck Fort Denison's Martello Tower. Fragments were later recovered from the suburbs of Cremorne and Mosman. None of it connected. A red flare went up over the middle harbour, illuminating the entire scene in hard light. HMAS Geelong's 20mm rounds turned the surface around M24 to white foam. Ban dived and moved west toward the harbour bridge. None of it found him. M24 disappeared beneath the water and was not seen again for nearly an hour and a half. Across the harbour, depth charges continued detonating in the area where Truman's submarine had been, long after any tactical purpose they served there had passed. M22 was on the harbour floor near the entrance, where it had been since Yandra's charges drove it down at 11:03. M24 was somewhere in the western harbour, running submerged and undetected. At the Garden Island Naval Base, the welding yard lights were still burning. Muirhead Gould had sounded the general alarm at 10:27 in the evening. An hour and a half later, the floodlights illuminating the waterfront 200 metres from Chicago's anchorage had not been ordered off. Chicago, moored at the man-of-war anchorage, remained backlit by the lights of Australia's own naval base. Ban manoeuvred M24 through the western reaches of the harbour for the better part of an hour, moving carefully and staying submerged. He was not pursued. By 12:29 in the morning of the 1st of June, he had brought M24 to a position off Bradley's Head in the eastern middle harbour and raised his periscope. Across the water, Chicago's silhouette was clear. At 12:25 in the morning, the Garden Island welding yard lights had finally been extinguished. They had been burning for 1 hour and 58 minutes after the general alarm. They went out 5 minutes before Ban fired. The first torpedo left M24's forward tube at 12:29 in the morning of the 1st of June, 1942. It missed. The torpedo ran toward Chicago across the harbour water. It passed the cruiser. It ran on toward the Garden Island wharf. It passed beneath Dutch submarine K9, moored against the wharf with a crew of its own aboard. It ran ashore. It struck the seawall at Garden Island at an angle that prevented the detonator from functioning. It skidded up the embankment and came to rest on dry ground without exploding. 750 men were alive because of what Ban had miscalculated in the darkness through his periscope. Chicago's complement would see the morning. Ban adjusted his position. He raised his periscope. Chicago was still there, still moored, still stationary. He had not been engaged. No depth charge had been dropped near M24. He fired his second torpedo. It also missed Chicago. Running toward the Garden Island wharf from a fractionally different angle, the torpedo passed beneath K9 for a second time. K9's crew was not harmed. The round ran on until it struck the harbour bed beneath a vessel moored against the Garden Island retaining wall, HMAS Kuttabul, a converted Sydney Harbour ferry serving as an accommodation ship for naval ratings, who could not be berthed ashore. HMAS Kuttabul was not a warship. She had spent her working life carrying passengers between Manly and Circular Quay. She had no military armament and no military capacity. What she had that night were men sleeping in their bunks in her lower decks, in the spaces her designers had intended for commuters on a daily harbour crossing. The torpedo detonated against the retaining wall beneath her with a force that picked the ferry up and broke her from below. The explosion was felt through the floors of homes half a kilometre away. Ornaments fell from shelves. Pieces of timber were thrown into the air above the waterline. Kuttabul settled at the stern and began to sink. 21 men died. 19 were Royal Australian Navy ratings. 2 were Royal Navy. British sailors serving far from the countries that had produced them. Frank Kirby, Royal Navy, was among them. So was David Blacktrist, Royal Navy. And Leslie William Bland and John Samuel Asher, and 17 other Australians whose names are on the Roll of Honour. They had gone to sleep in their bunks aboard a converted harbour ferry because there was nowhere else to put them. Bandsman M.N. Cummins had boarded HMAS Kuttabul approximately 5 minutes before the torpedo struck. When the explosion destroyed the ferry's lower sections, he did not make for shore. He stripped off and went into the cold, dark water of the harbour, diving into the broken interior of a sinking vessel filled with shattered timber and glass, and men who could not move on their own. He dived, he surfaced, he dived again. Across the next several minutes, Cummins pulled 3 critically injured men out of the wreckage of the sinking ferry. Ordinary seaman L.T. Combers went back separately and brought out another. 10 more ratings were wounded aboard Kuttabul. Shortly after 12:30 in the morning, M24 turned away from the Garden Island anchorage and began moving back toward the harbour entrance. Chicago remained at her anchorage. Ban had fired both torpedoes. He had not sunk Chicago. He had killed 21 men who were not Chicago. His mission, by any tactical measure, had failed to hit what it aimed at. By any human measure, it had produced a catastrophe inside a vessel that had nothing to do with the war, except that the war had assigned it a purpose. The detonation under Kuttabul was the moment Boda was finally converted from skepticism to belief. The departure orders he had revoked when he returned from dinner were now reinstated. At approximately 1:58 in the morning of the 1st of June, the indicator loop at the harbour entrance recorded a crossing. Almost certainly it was M24. Sub-Lieutenant Ban and Petty Officer Ashibe, having entered the harbour at 9:48 the previous evening, having navigated its full breadth for more than 4 hours, having fired both torpedoes and killed 21 men, were leaving. They were leaving at 1:58 in the morning. USS Chicago departed at 2:14 in the morning. The submarine that had entered the harbour, navigated its waters for 4 hours, fired 2 torpedoes, sunk a vessel, and killed 21 men had been gone for 16 minutes before the 750-man warship it had been targeting finally slipped her moorings and moved. Chicago had sat moored and stationary from the moment the first indicator loop recorded M14's crossing at 8 o'clock the previous evening until 2:14 in the morning. 6 hours and 14 minutes. During those 6 hours and 14 minutes, 3 Japanese submarines had entered the harbour. One had destroyed itself in the boom net. One had fired twice at Chicago, missed twice, killed 21 men on a converted ferry, and departed. The third was still on the harbour floor. Somewhere east of Sydney Heads, in the early hours of the 1st of June, M24 was moving through open ocean toward the rendezvous point southeast of Port Hacking. The mother submarines were waiting. Ban and Ashibe did not arrive. Matsuo's submarine had been lying on the floor of Sydney Harbour since HMAS Yandra's depth charges drove it down at 11:03 the previous evening. It had been there for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, everything that constituted the attack on Sydney Harbour had unfolded above it. Truman had destroyed M14 in the boom net. Ban had manoeuvred M24 across the harbour, fired both his torpedoes, killed 21 men on Kuttabul, and departed. The entire arc of the night had played out above a submarine sitting on the harbour floor with its engines idling and its crew alive, waiting for the pattern of propeller noise and depth charge concussions above them to change enough to risk moving. By 3 in the morning, Muirhead Gould ordered HMAS Seamist and HMAS Steady Hour from their Farm Cove moorings to search the harbour between Bradley's Head and the boom. Lieutenant Athol Townley, commanding Steady Hour and the search operation, ordered Lieutenant Reg Andrew in Seamist to set his depth charges for 15 metres, a setting shallow enough that the vessel doing the dropping would barely clear the blast radius of its own ordnance. Andrew set his charges and began moving toward Bradley's Head. At approximately 5 in the morning, in Taylor's Bay, Andrew spotted a dark object in the water. He fired a flare to warn other vessels clear. He pushed Seamist to full speed and crossed the position directly. He dropped his first depth charge. M22 rose above the surface. Andrew dropped a second charge. The submarine went back below the surface. Seamist's own engines were damaged by the force of the twin blasts. Steady Hour, HMAS Yaroma, and the other Hollywood fleet vessels that had converged on Taylor's Bay continued dropping charges on the position for the next 3.5 hours. RAN divers went down in the morning to assess what the charges had done. They found M22 on the harbour floor. Its engines were still running. The contra-rotating propellers were still turning, slowly, with the patient mechanical indifference of machinery that continues after the men who operated it have stopped. The submarine was raised by crane on the 10th of June. Inside were Lieutenant Matsuo and Petty Officer Tsuzuku, both dead from self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Matsuo's father's ceremonial sword was recovered. His senimbari was recovered. Both were catalogued and placed in storage. Competing claims from multiple Hollywood fleet vessels subsequently complicated the official record of who had actually disabled M22. The Anzac Memorial's subsequent assessment is that these competing claims denied Lieutenant Reg Andrew and HMAS Seamist the credit they had earned. Andrew had found the contact, made the first attack, and inflicted the damage that ended the submarine. This was not reflected in the recognition he received. By the morning of the 1st of June, the Harbour Authority knew what had happened to 2 of the 3 submarines. M14 had destroyed itself in the boom. M22 was being raised from Taylor's Bay. The third, Ban Andashiba's M24, which had entered the harbour at 9:48 the previous evening, navigated its full length for 4 hours, fired both torpedoes, killed 21 men, and cleared the entrance loop before Chicago moved, was not in the harbour. It was not near the harbour. It was not anywhere. They would not find it for 64 years. On the morning of the 1st of June, 1942, the front pages of Sydney's newspapers carried the story of Operation Millennium, the Royal Air Force's first 1,000 bomber raid over Germany. The Japanese attack was not on the front pages. The federal censor had imposed total censorship on the events within hours of the attack's conclusion. The official statement issued on the afternoon of the 1st of June described the sinking of HMAS Kuttabul and the 21 deaths she produced as the loss of one small harbour vessel of no military value. Smith's Weekly broke the real story on the 6th of June. Its follow-up on the 13th of June caused further political damage. The Royal Australian Navy moved to charge the newspaper with releasing defence information. There was no official inquiry. The decision was deliberate. An inquiry would follow the already damaging public investigation into the defences that had preceded the Japanese bombing of Darwin 3 months earlier, and the government's assessment was that successive public examinations of successive defence failures would produce a defeatism that could not be managed. The multiple prior warnings, the Newcombe letter of January, the New Zealand radio direction fixes of the 26th and 29th of May, the Iron Cove radar detection dismissed as a glitch, the artillery battery at Middlehead that watched Ito's float plane and called it American, the 14-year-old roof spotter whose report of a distinctive engine sound reached the naval authorities and went nowhere were not publicly examined. Nobody was formally held accountable. On the 9th of June, the bodies of Truman, Omori, Matsuo, and Suzuku were given full military honours at Sydney's eastern suburbs crematorium. 4 coffins, each draped with a Japanese naval ensign. Muirhead Gould attended. Over 200 naval personnel were present. The gesture drew significant public criticism. In a radio broadcast, Muirhead Gould defended himself by asking his audience whether they should not accord full honours to men of such courage, men who had gone out in what he described as a steel coffin. The Australian government supported the ceremony privately, calculating that if it reached the awareness of Japanese soldiers responsible for hundreds of thousands of Australian prisoners of war, it might produce more humane treatment. Japanese authorities noted the ceremony. It did not lead to any measurable improvement in the conditions of Australian POWs. Japanese propaganda subsequently used footage of the military honours for its own purposes. The Australian High Command forbade similar ceremonies for enemy personnel in the future. 8 days after the attack, the Japanese were not finished with Sydney's coast. Just after midnight on the 8th of June, I-24 surfaced approximately 18 kilometres southeast of the Macquarie Light and fired 10 shells into the eastern suburbs. The rounds struck Rose Bay, Woollahra and Bellevue Hill. Only one exploded. The ammunition was armour-piercing, designed for steel hulls, entirely the wrong type for brick construction. A woman found her kitchen destroyed. Nobody was killed. That same night, I-21 surfaced off Newcastle. Commander Kanji Matsumura fired 34 shells in 13 minutes at the Newcastle shipyards. Fort Scratchley's guns replied with 4 rounds, the only occasion during the entire Pacific War when an Australian shore battery fired on an enemy warship at sea. Nobody in Newcastle was killed. The population that had turned out to watch submarines being raised from Sydney Harbour had now stood in its streets while shells struck its houses. The war the federal censor had described as producing no serious damage had struck Australia's 2 largest east coast cities within 8 days. The ships that had survived the 31st of May did not survive the year. HMAS Canberra, moored in Farm Cove during the Midget attack and never touched, was sunk on the 9th of August, 1942, at the Battle of Savo Island. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were lost at Savo Island in a single engagement, the worst surface defeat in the history of the United States Navy. USS Chicago was there too. Captain Bode was effectively in command of the Southern Cruiser Group when Canberra was destroyed. He sailed Chicago away from the battle. He did not radio a warning to any other vessel. His ship's main battery never fired. The Hepburn Board of Inquiry, convened to assess the Savo Island disaster, formally censured one officer from the entire engagement: Howard Douglas Bode. The report was not intended to be made public. Bode learned of its findings. He shot himself in his quarters at Balboa, in the Panama Canal Zone, on the 19th of April, 1943. He died the following day. He was 54 years old. Chicago herself was lost on the 30th of January, 1943, sunk by Japanese aerial torpedoes at the Battle of Rennell Island. Chicago Avenue in Maroubra, New South Wales, is named for her. None of the 5 Japanese mother submarines that had made up Sasaki's Eastern Attack Group survived the war. I-22 was sunk on Christmas Day of 1942 off New Guinea. I-27 was sunk in February of 1943 off the Maldives. I-24 was sunk in June of 1943 near the Aleutian Islands. I-21 was sunk in February of 1944 off the Marshall Islands. I-29 was sunk in July of 1944 in the Philippines. The attackers and the attacked were consumed alike by the war that had brought them together. What the attack left behind, in its immediate physical aftermath, were 2 damaged submarines and one whose location was unknown. The remains of M14 and M22 were joined together to form a composite vessel, as complete a specimen as the 2 damaged hulls could provide, and loaded onto a transport for public display. The composite toured New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia through the remainder of 1942 and into 1943. Thousands of Australians queued to see it. Money raised went to the Royal Australian Navy Relief Fund and the King George Fund for merchant sailors. The submarine now stands in the Anzac Hall of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, with an accompanying sound and light display. The conning tower is separately preserved at the Royal Australian Navy Heritage Centre at Garden Island, the same Garden Island whose welding yard lights had illuminated the harbour's largest warship for nearly 2 hours into the night of the attack. The question of M24 remained open. Ban had crossed the exit indicator loop at approximately 1:58 in the morning of the 1st of June. The mother submarines waited at the rendezvous point southeast of Port Hacking. He did not arrive. Ashibe did not arrive. M24 did not arrive. In the decades after the war, divers searched the harbour floor and the surrounding waters, and found nothing. The submarine that had done the most damage of the 3 had moved beyond human knowledge and stayed there. In May of 1968, Mrs. Matsue Matsuo, the mother of Lieutenant Q Matsuo, visited Australia. A Royal Australian Navy launch carried her out over the waters of Taylor's Bay to the position above where M22 had been raised 26 years earlier. She scattered cherry blossoms across the surface of the water. She was received by Prime Minister John Gorton. She visited the Australian War Memorial, where the director, Bill Lancaster, led her through the Anzac Hall to where the composite submarine stood on display. Lancaster then placed in her hands the Senembari. The belt of 1,000 stitches had been in the AWM's collection since her son's body was recovered from Taylor's Bay in June of 1942. 26 years in a storage catalogue. Lancaster placed it in her hands. She could not hold it. He held her instead. She returned to Japan and appeared on national television. She chanted 2 poems she had written on the flight home. The second expressed that probably only heaven understood her emotions, and that she had returned safely from her pilgrimage to Australia. In November of 2006, members of a recreational diving club based in Sydney, who called themselves the No Frills Divers, were working a site off the northern beaches approximately 5 kilometres offshore from Bungan Head near Newport. In 54 metres of water, half buried in sand and entangled in decades of accumulated fishing nets, they found a submarine, 24 metres long, a conning tower intact, propellers visible at the stern. Through a window in the hull, the interior was visible, filled with sand and mud and darkness. Details of the discovery were broadcast on the Nine Network's 60 Minutes program on the 26th of November, 2006. The government declared a 500-metre no-entry exclusion zone on the 1st of December. Maritime archaeologists confirmed the identification by comparative analysis with the composite at the Australian War Memorial. It was M24, Ban and Ashibe's submarine. The vessel that had escaped the harbour while Chicago was still moored, that had fired the torpedoes and left the dead behind, that had slipped past every weapon turned against it, and then vanished into the Pacific, and stayed vanished for 64 years. The exit ladder had not been deployed. Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban and Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe had not left the submarine before it went to the bottom. Their remains almost certainly lie inside it still, in that water, in that sand, in a vessel that also contains more than 50 kilograms of the unstable TNT in the scuttling charges they never detonated. In Japan, a 74-year-old retired doctor named Ban Kazutomo watched the broadcast from his home. He was the younger brother of Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban. He wept on television. He could not speak. In 2018, a public ballot was held. 2 groups of 10 divers were permitted to make commemorative dives to the wreck site. One of the divers reported afterward that the submarine was teeming with fish. On the night of the 31st of May, 1942, the 2 most senior Allied officers responsible for Sydney Harbour and the largest warship inside it were at dinner together. One had spent years investigating how submarines penetrated harbour defences and had been appointed, on the strength of that expertise, to prevent it happening again. The other had already lost one command to an attack he had not been present to respond to. Between them, at that dinner table, was more institutional knowledge of what was possible and more direct experience of what happened when warnings went unacted on than most command structures could have assembled in a single room. The harbour boom was incomplete. The indicator loop warning had been written and filed 4 months earlier. The reconnaissance float plane had been identified as American. A 14-year-old roof spotter had heard its engine and filed a report that went nowhere. The New Zealand Navy had provided radio direction fixes that were not followed up. And on the night of the 31st of May, Sub-Lieutenant Ban followed a Manly ferry through the eastern gate of the boom, fired 2 torpedoes at a cruiser he could see clearly, because the naval base 200 metres behind it still had its lights on, and left the harbour 16 minutes before the cruiser he had targeted finally moved. Frank Kirby, Royal Navy, never came home to England. David Blacktrist, Royal Navy, never came home to England. Leslie William Bland and John Samuel Asher, and 17 other men whose names are on the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial never came home either. The official statement issued the afternoon after they died described 21 of them as one small harbour vessel of no military value. The statement was not corrected. The inquiry was not held. The boom net, when eventually completed, was never tested against an enemy again. 6 Japanese submariners entered Sydney Harbour on the night of the 31st of May, 1942. 4 died inside it within hours. 2 of them are still there, in 54 metres of water off Bungan Head, inside a submarine still containing its dead and more than 50 kilograms of explosives that have been unstable for more than 80 years. Ban and Ashibe fired their torpedoes. They missed the ship they aimed at. They killed 21 men who were not that ship. They left the harbour before the ship they had targeted finally moved. Their submarine was found 64 years later by weekend divers, and it is still there, teeming with fish, waiting. The distance between what was known before that night and what was prepared against it is the distance in which the real history of that night is written. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, all of them, the 21 sailors on Kuttabul, and the 6 Japanese submariners who wrote their farewells before they separated from their mother submarines in the swell off Sydney Heads, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand why the defences of cities that cannot believe they are in range are always the last ones to be fixed, watch this next.